Hello there, and welcome to another PhotoGP photo editing video. This time we're going to depart from the photo reconstruction theme to address a question I got recently from one of my Patreon supporters. What shutter speed should I use for panning shots? In a few minutes, I'll show some examples of different shutter speeds and talk about the pros and cons of each. But first, what is a panning shot? Simply put, it's when you move the camera side to side so that you're tracking a moving object, such as this image of Marc Marquez at Indianapolis in 2013. In motorbike racing, you're panning all the time when trackside. The alternative is to shoot the bikes as they come toward you or move away from you. These types of images require different techniques, but today we're talking about panning shots. Panning shots are pretty tricky because in general you want to keep the camera as still as possible during the exposure. But when you're panning, you're deliberately moving the camera and trying to do so at the same rate that your subject is accelerating or decelerating. A MotoGP bike, after all, is only ever going a constant speed when in pit lane and the rider has the speed limiter on. When a bike is on track and its rider is trying to go fast, it's always accelerating or decelerating toward the next turn. So when you're panning, you're trying to accelerate or decelerate the camera at a rate that matches what the bike is doing. This takes practice. What shutter speed should you use for panning shots while you're practicing? That's a great question because the shutter speed you select for your panning shot will determine a couple of important things: how much blur you have in the background and on the bike's moving parts, and how difficult it is to get the bike sharply in focus. A faster shutter speed, a 640th or 500th of a second, will make it easier to have the bike in focus, but there will be less motion blur in the background. A slower shutter speed, 1/300th or a 250th of a second, will be just the opposite. Harder to get the bike in focus, but more motion blur in the background. But should you always use a slower shutter speed because you always want more motion blur? That depends on what you want your photos to communicate. What are you trying to show the person looking at your photograph? Shutter speed is vitally important to me when I'm making photographs of racing because it's one of the best ways to show the speed, and that sense of speed comes in large part from motion blur. Now, I don't mean blur like out-of-focus blur. That's bad blur, the kind we try to avoid unless we're adding it on purpose as an element of the image. I mean the blur you get when everything except the subject of your photo, or some part of your subject, becomes to some degree soft, usually horizontal lines of blurred color. In this image, for example, the rider's helmet is nice and sharp in focus. You can even see his face inside it. But down here, the grass has lots of motion blur, the wheels have lots of motion blur as they're spinning. That's the kind of blur we like in a panning shot. Motion blur in a motorcycle image, as we saw in the previous sample, is not merely the movement of the bike and rider against the background, it's also seen in the rotation of the tires and wheels. To me, it's a cardinal sin to use such a high shutter speed that the wheels are frozen and appear not to be moving at all. So if our panning shots don't have enough blur, well, how much blur is enough and how much is too much? I can't answer these questions for you because these decisions are part of what defines your personal style of photography. And one more note before we look at some shutter speed examples. These are not absolute, these shutter speeds. They're relative to the speed of the subject. 400th of a second would be too fast for a nice panning shot in pit lane, but if the rider is really cooking on a fast section of track, 400th might be plenty slow to get some nice motion blur in that image. So let's look at these sample images with the shutter speeds and see the differences. This is a series of images I made at Silverstone 2014 with an article on the subject in mind. I wanted to have all these images in the series be of the same rider, but Jack Miller went into the pits after only a couple of laps. In this first example, the shutter speed is 640th of a second. Notice that the letters in the background are legible. You can see the Generali here, and the seams and the red curb are visible down here. The grass has texture even if the individual blades aren't distinct. The entire rider and the bike are sharply in focus thanks to the f8 aperture. There's nothing wrong with this image, but it doesn't have much sense of speed to me, of the rider and the bike moving quickly from left to right. They are doing so. This is a fast turn at Silverstone, but the photo doesn't really convey that very well. In this one, we've dropped down to 1/400th of a second. We have more motion blur in the grass and the red curb, right down here and here. And the Generali letters in the background are starting to get a bit fuzzier than they were in the previous one. At 1/200th of a second, things improve further still. The front of the bike is still nicely in focus, but look how fuzzy the letters in the background are. There's much more movement in this image than in the previous two. The rider is also a bit fuzzier because as he's riding through the corner, he's moving his body on top of the motorcycle. My camera is tracking the front of the bike, and he's moving on a different axis, so the slower shutter speed reveals this is a bit of motion blur on the rider himself. At 1/25th of a second, we're really talking. Miller dropped out of the example series, and we have Alexei Masmu instead. He looks like he's going much faster through this corner. We're seeing much more of the grass during the longer exposure, the slower shutter speed allowing the camera to see more of the area around the rider. For the final shot in this series, Brad Binder joins us at 1/80th of a second. There's quite a bit more motion blur in the rider as he moves on a different axis from the bikes. The white letters in the background are now merging into each other very nicely. The grass and the red curb are smears of color. Binder's bike has yellow wheels on it, and it's much easier to see how fast they are turning compared to the black wheels of the previous riders. Now you may look at this slowest example, slowest shutter speed I mean, and think that you don't like this image as much as the early ones where the bike and rider were more in focus as a pair. Perhaps you don't care for so much motion blur. And that's fine, because all this chat about shutter speeds is intended to get you thinking about what you're after in your photographs. Personally, I generally like a lot of blur, but I also like a variety. So when I'm shooting panning shots, I do some at a 500th of a second. A couple laps later, I drop down to 200th. A couple laps later, I drop down again, perhaps even some more. There are times when I go much slower than 1/80th of a second. Now, a few notes on the practicality of panning at slower shutter speeds. The slower your shutter speed, the more images you'll miss because nothing is in focus. But when you get one, the payoff is fantastic if you like that type of image. If it doesn't appeal to you, all this motion blur, then save yourself the trouble and shoot at 500th or 400th of a second. They're your photos, so you decide what you want them to look like. Also, keep in mind that when you're shooting with a slow shutter, you're taking a risk that something dramatic might happen. Your chances of catching it nicely in focus are lower. This would be a fantastic crash shot if Paul Espargaro's head were in focus instead of his shin, or even if the front of the bike were in focus and he was a massive motion blur, that would be better. Imagine the same about this one. If I'd been shooting at 500th of a second instead of 1/60th, this would be a remarkable photo, assuming I got the rider in focus. Paul was okay, by the way. Got his bell rung pretty good, but he walked away and rode again a short time later. If he'd been injured in this crash, well, that's an entirely other discussion on what to do with photos that show injuries. Remember that panning is not only for trackside. Look for other opportunities to use motion blur to add drama to your images via slow shutter speeds. Also, look for elements in the environment that work well for slow shutter panning. My buddy Dan Lowe is a master of this. I'll add a link in the notes to some of his work. Slow shutter work can also help disguise an ugly racetrack. This is Yanni Hernandez at Silverstone, one of the least photogenic circuits on the MotoGP calendar. They've got fences, toilets, concrete, all sorts of unappealing junk in nearly every background. But a slow shutter speed blurs that junk into a soft background that is at least a bit less unappealing. Remember that as you're improving your panning skills and experimenting with which shutter speeds in any given situation deliver the results that look good to you, you'll make a lot of mistakes and delete a lot of images that have nothing or the wrong thing in focus. This is simply part of the process, so don't let it discourage you. Even after practicing this stuff and thinking about it quite a bit, I throw away many more panning shots than I keep. So be kind to yourself as you practice and learn. Let's have a discussion about this in the comments. What do you think about what I've said in this video? How does your experience compare with mine? Feel free to ask about any of the images shown and I'll tell you what I can. Finally, you may be wondering what's paying for this video. Probably not, but I'll tell you anyway. It took hours to write the text for this episode, collect the images and arrange them to fit into the text, record the video and the audio, edit both so you don't have to listen to my ums and ahs and coughs and throat clearing. Well, it's my supporters on Patreon who chip in a few bucks each month to keep me producing content like this. And they get some pretty cool rewards in return, including a longer, more in-depth version of this video in 1080 resolution. I'll put a link in the notes to my Patreon page, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a look and see if what I offer there is something you think is pretty cool. But if you're a YouTube-only person, that's fine too. Please help me out by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and sharing on social media. Thanks for watching. See you next time.